Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How are you, Sasha? How's it going?
It's going very well. I've really been thinking a lot about and anticipating this conversation. I'm honestly a little bit nervous, but I'm also eager. And I doubt this will be the formal end-all, be-all, one-time conversation that needs to happen on this issue. But talking about gender dysphoria in boys is really important.
I am also nervous. And I am also intent on trying to give everything a good airing so that people will feel maybe more thoughtful about male transition. And that would be my objective out of this specific episode. And I really want to kind of emphasize my own position, which is I don't think we know yet. I think we're halfway through, if that, an understanding of transition, let alone male transition. And so everything we say it's quite speculative, and I think it does add to everybody's knowledge. But I do think I've a huge caveat of, honestly, there's been so much suppression, specifically around autogynephilia, that it's very hard to have much trust in having the full knowledge yet. We just don't have it yet. I think it's been suppressed by so many different groups that it's extraordinary. I'd love to know, has there ever been any other condition that has been so successfully suppressed? Because it feels scary even to speak about it sometimes. And, when I'm engaged on Twitter, for example, to speak about it, I don't want to talk about it because I just know that I'll get forever more screenshotted one half sentence that I said, and it'll be taken out of context and, used against me as some sort of evidence that I think A, B, or C, when I would say, I'm not sure what I think. I think it's very... It's a very unfinished business, is what I would say it is.
Well, let's start with maybe some definitions, and then we can kind of tease everything apart. So, we spoke with Dr. Ray Blanchard for our Pioneers series, as well as Dr. Michael Bailey, who's also studied this, and Dr. Anne Lawrence, who wrote a very comprehensive kind of firsthand narratives book about this. But autogynephilia comes from the Greek words for auto as self, gyne as woman, and philia as love. So the idea is it is the love of oneself as a woman. And by definition, it exists in males. And it's a very complicated set of experiences. And I think the way I view autogynephilia is that it's this kind of erotic / love component that can sit on top of whatever personality traits and other psychopathologies or characteristics an individual has. So in my view, if you take 100 different males who experience this erotic fantasy about becoming women, some of them are going to be shy, quiet, very kind of introspective, loner guys who are maybe into music or computers, while on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you might have this kind of sociopathic, aggressive, loud, narcissistic, really demanding man who they have a similar erotic fixation, but the way it manifests and looks publicly is very, very different. So we'll get into that more, but what else can you say about autogynephilia? There's a lot of other characteristics about it. Let's just define it more.
Yeah, it's a paraphilia, and there's lots of different paraphilias in the DSM, which is the kind of the diagnostic Bible. It's a very flawed diagnostic Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists. And there are different paraphilias, for example, voyeurism, exhibitionist disorder, frotteurism, which is rubbing up against people, and you know, men are 20 times more likely to have a paraphilia than women, and it often co-occurs. So, like one paraphilia will often co-occur with another paraphilia. So you could have two, or you could have three. So you could have a voyeur and an exhibitionist, for example. And as a result of it being a paraphilia, I think people are often very aware that paraphilias often cause a huge amount of distress because it's disordered behavior and it's compulsive and it can be incredibly damaging. Not only that, like you said, it can have other traits to make it much more dangerous. For example, narcissism, aggression, and things like that. But how much of it is not a paraphilia is uncharted water. We don't know that. You know what I mean? Whether people can have autogynephilic traits. For example, you can have autism and you can also have autistic traits. So that's something we'll get further into. But Ray Blanchard, oh yeah, do you want to go on? But
Well,
we'll go
I
over
just
definitions first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe later I'll take you up on
Yeah.
the idea of the paraphilia, but keep going about Ray Blanchard.
Yeah. So Ray Blanchard also talked about the homosexual transsexual, which is HSTS for the nerds among us. And the homosexual transsexual is an extremely feminine gay man who's so feminine he wants to transition, or he feels the need to transition. He believes that perhaps the world can only take him as a very extremely feminine man. Very often very sexualized as well, and very often have in the past, if you look at the studies, worked in a very sexualized role as well. So it's a difficult road as well, the homosexual transsexual, to be one, notwithstanding as well as that the sexual part there, might have in their lives. But there's also, as anybody who listens to our show regularly, there's the ROGD male.
Okay, can we just pause on the HSTS? I want to say something that I think is a key distinction. Homosexual transsexuals historically have not had the intense aversion to their sexual characteristics. So whereas an autogynephile really generally will hate his penis and his testicles and his broad shoulders, the HSTS is pretty much okay with the body, but they're often transitioning almost for more like pragmatic purposes because it might be easier to find a husband. It might be just easier to move through the world unnoticed as a woman, as a person might think. And I think this history of having worked in highly sexualized roles like in prostitution or whatever is also a function, I think, of how taboo homosexuality was. So I don't think that's necessarily the path of an HSTS today, but I just wanted to kind of touch on the body dysmorphia piece, which is different. So, okay.
Yeah.
ROGD.
And I will add, I just add to your point there that I think there'll be a lot of this today. I think, the HSTS could arguably be likened to the butch lesbian. You know what I mean? Extremely male-presenting woman can find it incredibly wearisome to be constantly stirred and thought of as a male, constantly questioned for being extremely male-presenting. And a lot of them end up transitioning these days because of a whole raft of reasons. Not particularly,
Sure.
I'm not saying this should happen, I'm saying this is happening.
Yeah.
And arguably it's the equivalent over with the extremely feminine. Is there really a word for, like, I suppose the equivalent of the butch lesbian, the femme gay guy, but it's not such a used phrase as the butch lesbian, which everybody knows very well. So I just see those two as kind of often similar paths of weariness, of not being allowed to be extremely male woman or when I say extremely masculine woman or an extremely feminine man. Society hassles them.
Yes, and I think it's not just that they break gender norms in their presentation and their mannerisms, but I think it's because they're so obviously homosexual that some people find that, people who are homophobic or find that off-putting, they become a target because of their love behaviors are almost on display in their gender nonconformity. Now, that has changed with ROGD because we have people transitioning who are ostensibly straight. So Do you feel like we can shift over to the ROGD category now and explain
Yeah,
it?
we'll be back.
We're very tentative. Yeah, we'll be back. Okay.
We'll be back about that point. But yeah, the ROGD obviously arrived in like a rocket, especially in the last 10 years. Very often neurodiverse, huge amount of online activity, generally, covets a gender identity, which could be non-binary, transmasc, femboy, there's so many different ones, and is part of a whole scene online that was not around in 1989 when Ray Blanchard was first talking about HSTS and AGP. It wasn't existing. And at the time when ROGD first came out, it was by an order of multitudes, magnitude, it was much more girls than boys. That has changed, and now they're saying around about 70% are girls and 30% boys, in and around. That's what seems to be the numbers. It isn't so strikingly obvious that they're girls. And some of them are gay, lesbian, and bisexual. I often think that's all overstated a little bit. A huge proportion, which is perhaps understated a little bit, are neurodiverse. I think that is a really notable, not always, but I think it's a more notable trait than being gay, lesbian, or bisexual for the ROGD kids. But again, this is anecdotal information. This is not, we don't have proper numbers. We're halfway through this.
I know. And I think like something we might have said at the outset is we have so little really hard data. But then again, I don't want to dismiss the value of being in the field with our kind of day-to-day experiences with patients. Sometimes research in and of itself, and even sexology categorization, which maybe we can talk about, it has some of its flaws, right? And there's nothing wrong with real world experience to try and inform thoughtful clinicians about what's going on. So I don't want to poo-poo the fact that, well, we don't have data, so therefore we can't really make any claims about this. No, I think we have some good growing anecdotal evidence. And the ROGD kids, even as you pointed out, many of them have autism or other neurodivergent traits. And of course, like other things, that can overlap with their sexual orientation. So there are some kids who are on the autism spectrum who are gay, lesbian, and bisexual, some who are straight, and some who have these, what you're calling paraphilias, I might say like very bizarre sexual interests, right? Like like uncommon or atypical sexual interests, including in females, right? So females who are on the autism spectrum are slightly more likely than females not on the autism spectrum to have these kind of odd sexual obsessions or interests. So paraphilias, or sexual orientations that are different, do co-occur with autism. And I think that's just worth touching on, because we see now, we already see how the Venn diagram of these categories is starting to overlap. And so we're getting lots and lots of traits on top of lots and lots of other traits.
Yeah, and I think the discourse online is very polarized, and it's trying to create clean frameworks with the messiness of the human condition, because we want clean frameworks because it makes our brains feel cognitively satisfied. But it's not necessarily the truth of actually what is the human. And just back up your point about sexologists and researchers, I couldn't agree more. I certainly wouldn't be massively shaped by research or sexologists' diktats about this, because I think that's how we got into trouble in the first place. I don't think it's the great God of research certainly doesn't open and close the case. There's a lot more to be said. And that's where the human, the complex nature of being human comes into play. And people can be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it's very irritating for everybody because we want clean. We want AGPs over there, ROGs over there, and HSTS are over there. And now we all know who we are. They're the villains. They're the goodies. You know what I mean? And everybody feels like I can now move forward. I don't have to think very much. I've clarified the world and I can move forward. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how humanity works. Sometimes very good people do bad things, and sometimes very bad people do good things. And sometimes people have terrible diagnoses. For example, people can have a really difficult diagnoses and be very difficult in what that aspect of their life, and actually very good and kind in other aspects of their life. And people don't want to hear that, but it's actually
Yeah.
the truth.
Yeah. So one kind of thing that I wanted to raise, which is, I think, just so important, because we are, we are grateful for the kind of like dedicated listeners we have on the show. And I also understand there's a lot of responsibility that comes with having a platform like this, especially given how polarizing gender is. And there are very few, people who are trying to bring the nuance in. And so I want to be really mindful to speak honestly and tell the truth where I see it. Because I think one of the really challenging aspects of autogynephilia is that it is invisible to the outside person. Whereas, just as we touched on before, for the HSTS or the butch lesbian who transitions, they wear their gender nonconformity and, in a way, their sexual orientation visibly. Autogynephilia is not visible. And clinically, what I can say is there are lots of people out there who are struggling with gender dysphoria, and they do have lots of these, let's say, ROGD-like backstories. There was the social influence. There was the internet. There was the girl at school pushing this belief system. And at the same time, there may be this deep, to the boy, shameful, very confusing, erotic component that it predated some of that stuff. So you can have a boy whose profile looks very much like an ROGD girl because it has all of those overlapping characteristics. And at the same time, there's something fundamentally different about his motivations and the erotic aspect of this experience for him. And I think a lot of people, understandably, they find this very icky. I mean, and I want to say, in total transparency, as a woman, I do find it very off-putting to think that a male believes that, like, being, let's say, sexually denigrated or penetrated or like putting on a wig validates his femininity. I find that very upsetting. And at the same time, as a clinician, I know such young people are struggling with something really complicated that they don't wish to have. I don't think anybody wades into this kind of knowingly because it's fun. Now, again, some people have these other pathologies like narcissism or whatever that feeds into it. But I know that there are a lot of young men who are genuinely struggling with these bizarre things that they don't understand and can't really explain, that would not be visible to anybody looking at them from the outside. So I know that's a lot, but I want to put that out there because anybody who's got a child, a son, I just think it's important not to dismiss the possibility, even though there may be nothing that you can necessarily do or say about it. But it's just important to know that this might be going on beneath the outward appearance.
Yeah, well, and I want to add to that like between a 10 and 20, the human generally becomes a sexual person. And that sexual awakening occurs in a complicated manner, very often. And often, so my point being that the ROGD girl could have some erotic elements of her trans identification, just like the ROGD boy could have erotic elements. And it's not necessarily AGP, and I'm certainly not talking about autoandrophilia, which is the female version as such of AGP, and it's hotly contested. I'm just talking about erotic elements do not make a paraphilia. And I know you have an issue with paraphilia. We'll go back to that in a second. This is why I don't land really in diagnosis. I became a psychotherapist for a reason. I remember when my mum and dad first, I was 30 for studying to be a psychotherapist. I came to it late. And I remember my mum and dad looking at me going, well, why wouldn't you be a psychologist? And I said, well, like, being a psychotherapist isn't the poor man's psychologist. And you could see by their face thinking it was. And I said, no, it wasn't for me, because I'm not interested in diagnoses and frameworks. I'm interested in the messy business
Yeah.
of being human. And that's why I land with ADHD traits, autistic traits, AGP
Yeah.
traits, ROGD traits. That's where I land, because I don't feel comfortable with these boxes. I think they miss things. And I'm very wary of people who are looking for gorgeous, a gorgeous matrix or a framework or a pathway and a diagnosis and the criteria. I think it's a kind of a defense mechanism to understand life. I understand the attraction towards it, but I don't think it's helpful. And so I really do think that this aspect of transition as being unnecessarily polarized into who's the AGP, find the AGP. And I'm like, hang on, what about if a few of these kids have AGP traits and they're not fully fledged AGPs? But there's one fourth category I do want to highlight before we move into kind of further business, because we've highlighted, let's say, the ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria. We've highlighted the autogynephilia, AGP, the HSTS, the homosexual, transsexual. I believe there's a fourth significant category. Again, I'm just saying traits of. I'm not interested in clean boxes, but I do think the groomed, especially male, has a very significant part to play in all this. I've just met too many kids who were groomed online and ended up trans-identifying as a result of pretty predatory behavior from males, older males, who got them into kind of shame-based sexual acts and kind of degrading sexual acts. Very easy to get a 13, 14-year-old boy, not so easy to get a girl, but it's possible, into very degrading sexual exploitation online. And I think they're a significant category. And I'm not saying that a lot of them would be very ROGD presenting, but there's an issue that has to be traced back. And they have been abused, and often they don't know they've been abused because they enjoyed it. It was their first series of orgasms. It's remained their first sexual kind of pleasure, and it's become a cornerstone around their sexual pleasuring. And so that is a whole really difficult, but I know I'm talking too much, but to go back to what I said, our difficulty around teenagers becoming sexual makes it really hard to speak about this, because we don't really feel comfortable. It's icky to talk about teenagers becoming sexual. Finally, I've stopped.
No, I love it. I mean, this is so interesting, and there's so many layers of this. Okay, so I want to kind of right off the bat, as a disclaimer, say, I'm female. I've only lived through a female puberty. I only know my own female, experiences. And of course, as a therapist, I work with males, so I try to understand them. But I have to concede that just in the same way that an autogynephile can't understand what it is to be a real woman, quote unquote, I can't understand what it's like to be a male and have male sexual drives and have that level of testosterone, because we have testosterone, but to have that level of testosterone coursing through the body. So I want to start there. And when I read Carol Hooven's book, Testosterone, and I've listened to firsthand accounts from FTMs who take testosterone, what I recognize is there is such a profound biological difference between the sex drive of males or people who are pumped up full of testosterone and the sex drive of females. So that is my disclaimer to say, I don't know what it's like to be a 13-year-old boy who is poking around online and then gets lured in by someone who's a groomer. I can't even imagine what that's like and all of the complex processes happening for that boy, okay? I do think that an important element that has come up a little bit in these discussions is that, let's say, autogynephilic traits. I like the use of the word traits. They probably exist on a spectrum, like many other things. So I suspect that historically, right, if we go back in the literature, first of all, there are hundreds of firsthand accounts from males describing this autogynephilic tendency that they had. And I suspect, given how obviously taboo this is, historically, males wouldn't even consider transitioning to, quote, women unless their autogynephilic tendencies were very, very powerful. And what we have today is something interesting because there are so many incentives to transition, including a culture that kind of shits on boys for being masculine, including a super celebration of all things trans. So I suspect that part of what we're seeing is boys who might have had like a molecule, a teeny molecule
Yeah.
of being aroused at the idea of having boobs, let's say, right? Which, if you think about teenage boy puberty, that's not a crazy thought. They're boob obsessed. So it's like boobs over there, boobs right here, boobs, yay, you know? So I suspect that if we wanted to be really pedantic about the labels, there are some people that might say, well, autogynephilic traits exist on a spectrum and there can be like a level 1 autogynephile and a level 10 autogynephile. And today, lots of people who are 5, 4, 3, 2 might be incentivized to transition, whereas back in the day, they would have just put that in the back of their mind. They wouldn't have really thought about it much. They would have moved on. They would have gotten married, had kids, and kind of gone unnoticed by society. And, you know, I think about the interview we did with Anne Lawrence, who, I mean, if we wanted to put autogynephilia on a scale, Anne Lawrence would have been a 10 out of 10, maybe a 20. Anne Lawrence describes an incredibly strong compulsion, an obsession with trying to get rid of her male genitals when she was a little boy. I mean, like very intense, something I can't, again, I don't have testosterone. I cannot imagine feeling that driven to do anything sexually, let alone being at war with my own body. So if autogynephilia is a testosterone driven experience, which I think it obviously is, if people today just have a teeny little bit of that experience, there's lots of additional material to pull them in further, like the sissy hypno porn and the groomers online and all of this stuff. So I imagine that this is really hard to tease apart. And just one more thing to complicate the story, autogynephilic fantasies often involve degradation.
Yeah.
And I don't think it only comes from the porn. I mean, I think from my clinical work, I think some of that is part and parcel with this male fantasy of what feminine means, which is submission and all that stuff that creeps us out as women, right? So messy.
Very. There's a couple of things you said there I want to kind of think about. I was listening to an extraordinary video, we'll link it, with Sasha White and this detransitioner guy, and he was talking about how he had a kind of nice childhood and then basically testosterone came into his life and ruined his life. And he was talking about like 11 hours of masturbation a day and stuff, and it was just like, whoa, like, whoa.
Yeah.
And he was sore, he was getting pain and blisters and all sorts of crazy stuff was happening. And like he was basically saying, I just wanted to go back. I wanted to go back to being a kid who just wasn't haunted to this awful beast.
Yes.
And it was harrowing listening to him. It was a harrowing story. So that's one thing that I just want to point out. Like there was a bloke who was just saying, I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. As he said, insane sex drive. He didn't ask for it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, you know what you said? I think this is a key thing that people often don't quite realize. What you said, which is that lots of men seem to have AGB traits and put it away, just like an awful lot of men, and it's not said enough. Like, you know, there's pedophilia, but there's also, I think you pronounce it hebephilia, which is an attraction to teenage girls, if you follow me. Yeah, teenagers. And that used to be very out in the open. When I was a kid, like the teenage pin-ups, the schoolgirl pin-ups, they were everywhere. It was an accepted part of society that there was certain men that really, and I remember them, they really fancied teenagers, and it was really noticeable with the way the girls that they'd go out with always looked very young. I remember there was this disgusting countdown for one famous girl who was very sexually, you know, she looked very sexual, and it was a countdown to her birthday when she was 16. It was, wow. It was awful. It was really awful. And so that aspect of when it's societally accepted to have it, like men have their way with it, when it's societally accepted. And the AGP tendency, these AGP traits, were put away by some men and not revisited. And some men went on to have happy lives. They knew they had that kind of sexual weirdness. Frankly, most of us have some sexual weirdness in the back of our head that we sometimes let out to play in the privacy of our own rooms, but that we have it, if you follow me. Do you know what I mean? That our minds go mad sexually wherever we go. I don't know where you go, Sasha, and you don't know where I go. We go strange places sexually, and some people, definitely some males, always consistently went there in their minds, and we didn't know about it. And then, arguably, from what I can gather, some of them discovered the internet, found each other, queer theory jumped in, and it went mad. Those men who had that tendency were told some crazy story, they jumped on it, and it gave them freedom to kind of really exploit that sexual strangeness that was in the back of their head. But I remember when I was younger noticing, and I wasn't a psychotherapist, I remember exactly when it was. I was 20, I was 25, it was the year 2000, and I remember noticing yet again a bloke had dressed up, a man in my group had dressed up as a woman for Halloween, and I could see that he was getting a sexual charge from it. I could see it, and I wasn't a psychotherapist, but I thought, this guy's getting off on this. And then I thought, lots of guys get off on this at Halloween. And I remember thinking, this is interesting. I just remember seeing it in him, and like, he didn't know I was seeing it in him, but I was thinking, he's charged by this. He's definitely, and he was loving it. And there was always this slew of men who wore these extraordinary slutty outfits at Halloween and were overexcited by it. You could see it in them. And then there was other blokes who were just the real blokes wearing the girls thing, and they were just doing it for Halloween. And you could see the difference. There was some who were just like, woo! And you could see see those men. They arguably had ATP traits. They just let it out to play at Halloween, and it didn't go mad. The whole going mad thing is a whole other episode. But the traits were in those men, I think.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I remember this one time I was a teenager, and I had spent the day with some friends, and the boy came over to my house after. He was in my room, and I went to the bathroom, and I came back to my bedroom, and he had gone into my closet and found a mini skirt and put it on. And he was kind of acting like, haha, this is such a funny joke. What's Sasha gonna say? As though he's just class clowning. And to this day, I mean, and anyone who knows me, I have the worst memory. I cannot tell you any like significant moments from high school. People will be like, do you remember when we went to so-and-so thing? And I'm like, I don't remember that entire year, but I will never get this memory out of my head, because there was something about, first of all, that he beelined to my closet and found a mini skirt was remarkable in and of itself. And then he put it on and wanted me to see him in it. And in hindsight, I make so much of that, but I just remember finding myself going, this is very weird. And it didn't feel like just a lighthearted joke, even though he tried to present it that way.
I wonder, will we see him on Benjamin Boyce one day?
I don't know. I don't know if I would even recognize him, but yeah, I mean, I think we're really like, this is an important thing to remember, that, male sexual drive is so, I mean, people say women are mysterious. I mean, male sexual drive is super mysterious because it can take a lot of bizarre twists and turns. And, there is this whole debate, and I just want to touch on this for a minute. I remember when we had Mike Bailey on, who look, I really, really like Mike Bailey. I would consider him a friend, but we kind of see things differently. And when we interviewed him and Ray Blanchard, we asked them about okay, this concept of quote paraphilias. Oh, yeah. And the way they described it is like, males may just have a propensity towards the paraphilia, but the specific version of it is of course dependent on their environment and their culture. So, furries, for example,
Oh yeah.
are a very particular thing. I highly doubt there's some sort of like a gene for being a furry, but because the individual has a propensity for strange subversive sexual fantasy and furries are there in their environment, that's what they end up latching onto. So, I doubt in the 1400s there were furry obsessions, but maybe there was some other kind of obsession having to do with like medieval knights or something. I don't know. But whether or not these things are innate or molded by kind of the culture, this is kind of a nature nurture question. It's very interesting. But it does seem as though for some males, the sexuality will be forceful and powerful and take them in directions that they don't even want to go.
Yeah. As well as that, like, there's the testosterone element of it, and it can be incredibly forceful for some males. But as well as that, there's autistic traits, that there's a
Yeah.
certain type of person who gets hyperfixated. And it's not just autistic, it could be ADHD traits. But there's certain neurodiversity that really is a big propensity to getting pretty fixated on something. And if that fixation happens to be around, let's say, female presentation or male presentation, or it could be around their sexual proclivities. It could also be around, just sexual relief. You know what I mean? Because for some people with autism, there can be a huge amount of kind of physical stimulation
Yeah.
because of their tension and their anxiety and their autism and you know what I mean? So there's more than one way, and that's for lots of different people. I'm not just saying autistic people, but I am saying that becoming fixated seems to me to be, it's not just, for example, you said it very well earlier on, that AGP, some of them could be very aggressive and narcissistic, some of them might not be at all. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
As well as that, some people can be hyper fixated, and some people just aren't
Yeah.
hyper fixated in their nature. And
Right.
therefore, their likelihood for them to become hyper fixated about anything isn't going to happen. And so
Yes.
they are having a different experience.
Remember when we talked to Debbie Hayton, who's a male to
Yeah.
female transsexual, and we asked Debbie about, her experience with dysphoria and all this stuff. And I think it was, I don't remember which one of us asked, but somebody asked, well, what were you like in your life before this? Were you the kind of person who, like, once you have a goal, you go for it all the way? And turns out that indeed Debbie was that kind of person who is very, very driven, once Debbie gets something in her mind, she has to have it. And that was also true for the fixation and obsession with transition. It became this thing like that Debbie couldn't get out of her mind. So that's such a good point, that personality traits will also determine whether or not a person gets stuck in this
Yeah.
fixation. And kind of like, this Twitter exchange I had recently with Aaron, I think Aaron Terrell, which we'll include it in the notes, but certain people will end up blowing up their lives over a fixation that they have. And it could be related to autogynephilia or totally unrelated. I mean, some people will have crazy affairs, gamble away all their money, just destroy
Yeah.
the
Good
life that
point.
they've worked so hard to build up. So this can just present itself in so many different iterations.
Well, compulsive behavior, I've read so many. I don't know why I'm so interested in them, but two things I've read an awful lot of is first person accounts in books of gambling, compulsive gambling,
Mm,
and anorexia. I think I just find the compulsivity of it just fascinating, but they will go all the way. And
yeah.
it's extraordinary how far they'll go. And I think it's very similar that some people, certain people with, for example, autogynephilic traits will go all the way. And somebody else will go all the way with gambling, somebody else will go all the way with anorexia. But could you perhaps, for our listeners, because it was very interesting, just to outline the kind of the bones of your exchange with Aaron Tyrrell? Because I know
Sure.
Aaron Tyrrell is kind of trans-identified female. He presents a trans man, and he's very, very interested in following all things to do with transition.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting the kind of conversation you've had with Aaron
Yeah.
online.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Aaron has been on our show before, and I think Aaron and I agree on pretty much everything. I think that the difference is that as a clinician, my interest is case by case depth of story, whereas Aaron is trying to, of course, as an observer of these phenomena, trying to make broad brushstrokes and trying to categorize things.
Aaron Tyrrell is having a lot of kind of thought-provoking conversations on Twitter about not only AGP, but about medical transition in general. And I'm not really engaging because I don't believe I have the space on social media to be able to kind of think my thoughts out loud, because there's certainly a lot of people who would be very quick to take my comments out of context. And so it's like, if I'm going to have something to say, I'm going to say it in this context, Sasha, or I'm going to write it out, or I'm going to say it in another interview. I'm just not going to, when I'm flicking on Twitter and having a cup of tea, I'm not going to do my quick off the bat thoughts around Twitter. It's not an environment that I can anymore. That day is gone.
I understand.
I'm trying to, by the way, wean myself off of Twitter addiction, so I just retweet all the time. I'm very trying not to comment. I'm just trying to get away from it in general. I find it's a massive time suck that I don't have the time for.
Yeah. So Aaron's piece is on his own Substack, and it's called "What's Going On with the Boys." And basically, what he's kind of outlining in the piece is that there is this question about whether or not ROGD boys are a completely distinct and unique group. And he, based on spending lots of time inside of like Reddit threads and online forums, not dissimilar to what somebody like Eliza Mondegreen does, like studying the online communities to try and understand what's going on. Aaron believes that a lot of the boys that some people in the gender critical circles might categorize as ROGD boys may indeed have autogynephilic traits underneath their gender dysphoria. So we kind of had an exchange back and forth. And, the main points that I wanted to make were that I agree with the idea that autogynephilia might exist on a spectrum, that our culture might be pushing more boys that had little bits of the trait into fully transitioning. I agree that, as I said earlier, autogynephiles can be both sensitive and sweet and autistic and creative and all those things that we say, and also have some of these odd sexual fantasies.
Totally.
And the big thing that I really want to touch on here is that Aaron is raising an important point, which is that when young males go to a therapist today with gender dysphoria, if they're going to an affirming therapist, they have zero chance of gaining insight about why they have dysphoria. They're just going to be told, you're just trans. Anyone who has a gender identity that differs from their birth sex is trans, and yay, go you, go girl, support transition, etc. However, there are a few of us now cropping up in the world who are taking a more exploratory approach. And I think Aaron's point is that gender critical therapists are hesitant to acknowledge that even in some of these boys that do have shame and they do have these like social influences and they do have other stuff, they're hesitant to ask about and or inform the patient about autogynephilic sexual experiences or fantasies and how that might inform the person about their dysphoria. Right? So the trope of being born in the wrong body isn't quite an accurate picture. But I think Aaron is arguing it may also not be accurate to say this is all socially mediated for you. There might be a different component underneath as well. And I totally agree with that. And I think the areas where Aaron and I also discussed that I think is important is the concept of pseudo-bisexuality, which maybe we can touch on a little bit. But I think there is an issue because so many people are disincentivized from really talking about autogynephilia, partially because it is icky and it's strange and a lot of us find it really difficult to understand. But also there might be this false narrative cropping up where like if a person has ROGD traits, they necessarily can't be autogynephilic. That's not accurate.
Yeah. It's not only inaccurate, it's really damaging to see people like that. That if they have ROGD, then they don't have AGP. If they have AGP, they don't have ROGD. It's so reductionist and it's so depressing to watch this kind of be kind of hammered home online. especially with a diagnosis such as AGP, which has been so suppressed by so many people. And now it's getting suppressed for all sorts of other reasons. For example, people think that by speaking about AGP, you're somehow normalizing it rather than raising public awareness, which I think is a significant difference. And I think there should be a public awareness campaign raised about autogynephilia so people know what it is and they know when they're presented with it. Because what would we do if we didn't know what exhibitionism was? What would we do? If we didn't know that was a thing, and then we were confronted with somebody who's exhibitionist, we'd take issue with it. But yeah, I think I would like to hear what you've got to say about the pseudo-bisexuality. But as well as that, I'd like to bring the parents into it because I think they've had a very, very awful, horrible, tragically difficult time. And I've met so many parents of boys who feel a deep sense of shame that maybe their child has some AGP traits. And I'm like, oh my God, in fairness, teenage boys can have huge amounts of erotic aspects of their life. And you don't have to feel like ashamed of that fact, but the online discourse has created this.
Yeah, totally. And so we'll talk about pseudo-bisexuality. Then I want to talk about this public awareness campaign idea because I've heard you raise this. So pseudo-bisexuality, again, it's this kind of complicated thing to understand, but it makes sense in context. So the nature of AGP is often referred to as the love that cannot speak its own name or something like that. And I think
like
that's
Oscar Wilde said that about homosexuality.
Yeah, it's kind of a lovely phrase because it really does describe this conundrum, right? Because a male who has autogynephilia wants to do everything in his power to suppress and deny his maleness. And he pursues this kind of feminine accoutrement with all of his energy and power and testosterone-driven force. And if he acknowledges that he's male with gender dysphoria, that is a destruction of the fantasy bubble. Whereas like HSTS, they're like, yeah, I know I'm a guy and I have gender issues and I'm going to transition. Or even the butch lesbian can acknowledge that she's female, but it's more the dysphoria shows up differently. But autogynephilic dysphoria is very difficult to even accurately acknowledge. So a bizarre thing happens in the sexuality where the primary orientation, I would say, is both straight in that they're gynephilic, meaning they like feminine female things, feminine people, female people, but it's also autogynephilic, meaning they want to become the feminine. But sometimes these individuals also behave in ways that are stereotypically homosexual behavior. So these are men who, again, as we touched on earlier, the idea of being wanted by a man, pursued by a man, penetrated by a man, really helps to validate their feminine identity as they fantasize about it in their minds. So it's not uncommon for autogynephiles to engage in risky sexual behavior with men and to engage in kind of online materials where a trans woman is being kind of denigrated and, engaging sexually with straight, quote, straight men, which, I would say that's a debate as well. But anyway, point being, autogynephiles are not gay, but they engage in same-sex sexual behaviors.
And there's something else I want to add to this, that being degraded sexually is often manifested of people who have been abused sexually. Not always, but some people who have been sexually abused in childhood, for example, people who might have been groomed or people who might have been sexually abused, can get themselves inadvertently and understandably into things as adults that is really involving kind of sexual experiences that remind
reenact.
them of what reenact what happened to them originally when they were being exploited. It's like something got shaped at that time and they go back to it and they go back and they revisit it, trying to make sense of it perhaps, you know what I mean, how to psychologically unpick it, but also because it was their first forms of perhaps sexual awakenings. There's a lot of reasons it could be. And so it's not necessarily somebody with AGP traits who is reenacting child sexual abuse, but it could be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that people sometimes miss, if you follow
Yeah.
me, that this can be part of it. And I think that's something that I don't think people appreciate. The second thing is, I think it's getting totally lost, and I find it astonishing that it's lost, is you very eloquently expressed it. When somebody is AGP, they are fully invested. If they're fully AGP traits, they've got all the way and they have transitioned to female, they are in a fantasy, a kind of 24-hour fantasy of I am female, I am woman, this is me. And when somebody actually says, I'm AGP, I have autogynephilia, I have a paraphilia, I have these traits, they are one step removed. It's like the anorexic who's admitted anorexia or the alcoholic who's admitted alcoholism. They aren't the same. They've already created a scenario where they're one step out of their autogynephilia by admitting that they're male, by admitting that they have autogynephilia. They are puncturing the very fantasy that makes them so delusional in the first place. So once they puncture that delusion, they can't be considered the very same as somebody who's completely living 24 hours, 7 days a week in the delusion. These are two very different kettles of fish. One has admitted their traits, has admitted they're male, and are therefore much more able to talk in quite a clear way about it, versus somebody who's completely delusional and is kind of far from reality.
Yes, I agree with you. However, my caveat would be I don't think it's delusional, because what I think clinically is happening is that these individuals, it is always right beneath the surface that they're male. And it's so distressing, and lots of little moments poke through the fantasy all the time. And it becomes a 24/7 putting out fires operation to remain in the fantasy. It's actually so impossible for a lot of people.
Well, and that's mental illness for you. When you talk to anorexic and they talk about reading menus online all the time, and they look at pages and pages of food all the time because they're starving and they can't stop thinking about it. Do you know what I mean? So you're right, that's mental illness, that there's a great ability for the human, a terrible, tragic ability for the human to be able to present as A and actually B is the reality, and they don't look at it. It's been the downfall of many of us that we are all invested in A and B is the reality, and we're frightened of it and we run away from it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this lifts up another really challenging thing, which kind of brings us back to the Erin Terrell exchange. I think Erin is saying, if a young man is having gender dysphoria and a therapist is willing to kind of explore the underlying roots with him, he deserves to know if he has these autogynephilic traits, so that he has a framework for why does he put on, sister's underwear and get a boner, right? Like, is it because you were born in the wrong body, or is there a name for this thing? And like, can we just take away some of the stigma? I mean, obviously it's very disruptive to the whole family, and that's a different issue, but I think a relevant issue. But I think this kind of ties in with how hard it is actually to bring light to this with patients in the clinical setting, because not only does the condition itself have built-in resistance to self-knowledge, but this whole thing has become so stigmatized. And lots of trans activists say AGP has been debunked, this is not a real thing. And like, when you see the trans activists saying this online and you look at their profile photo, you're like, okay, right. I get it. I understand. But, to be fair, I think there are all these like self-aware autogynephiles that are trying really hard to say, like, hey, it's okay to be a male and have this thing. There are ways to live with it. You don't necessarily have to transition. You don't necessarily have to identify as a woman. And there's like, I think, a broad spectrum of options that one has if they can objectively, non-pathologizingly kind of acknowledge this. And so this is kind of maybe where we can touch on the question of paraphilia and mental illness, because given that this is a spectrum, I do think there are probably lots of people who can integrate this kind of odd sexual drive in ways in their life that don't necessarily impede their ability to like have a fulfilling life and do the things that they want to do, and don't necessarily step on the toes of others, right? So I'm sure there are like healthy ways to incorporate this experience into your self-understanding. But obviously there are times, and those are the times that are the most obvious. You see trans activists online who are just these huge burly guys, and they're screaming to be called women. Like, man, that is such an obvious example of how this fantasy can blow up your life and the life of others. So for me, I don't know if paraphilia is a clinically useful term, because if I were working with a client who had these traits, that's not the first place I would go in trying to help them understand themselves. But I definitely see sometimes this is super maladaptive. So,
Yeah.
what do
If
you
it's a
think?
compulsion, it's more likely to be a paraphilia, if you follow me. So if you had a client who just kept on, engaging in voyeurism or kept on exhibitionism, you'd think, okay, we've got a compulsion, like I say, compulsive gambling. You know what I mean? That it just doesn't make sense. It's a massive destruction to their lives. That's different than having traits of.
Mm,
You know what I mean? Where it's not necessarily destroying their life, but I think the I know I keep on talking about it, but the online discourse has become so saddening because the ability for people to discuss what could be going on has become very suppressed. And so, the ability to speak about what Phil Lilly, for example, is trying to do by, he's trying to present, and he says him, and he came to the Denver conference, and it was extraordinary what happened afterwards as a result of him attending a conference in a blue dress. And so it feels like if if there is no room at all for autogynephilia philic behavior, and I don't know whether there should be or there shouldn't be, but I'm like, okay, so are we going to just put this underground? Are we going to just make this completely a subversive, toxic scenario where nobody can speak about it or try to say, well, how do we handle this? And
yeah.
also, are we going to completely pretend, for example, that none of these ROGD boys have some tendencies? And are the parents kind of in a prison of shame because they've seen some elements of what must be AGP traits in the bedroom? For
Mm-hmm.
example, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
maids' outfits or whatever. And how do the parents handle this? There's so much shame around it. But not only that, I have to say it again, there's some females, go and look at FTM Reddit and tell me that there isn't some erotic aspect of this, because you'll see it very quickly on FTM, that's female to male Reddit. You will see a lot of erotically charged conversations, all the fan fiction. Helena was particularly, she's a detransitioner, she was particularly eloquent in describing, you know what I mean, the elements of erotica around
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
transition. That I just think, yeah, of course there is. We're human. We have sexual impulses.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I tend to, like, as we record these episodes and whenever I'm having these conversations in public, it's hard because I'm talking to so many different populations. So many
Yeah.
different people are listening to us. There are parents listening to us who, of course, they would have a very different experience in trying to think about these things. And it's not that there's like a different truth for each population of listeners, but there are different ways of discussing things so that the ideas can become more palatable and like go down a bit more smoothly. And I do always think about, if an autogynephilic young man was listening to this podcast, like how would this conversation land on him in trying to, maybe he's trying to be like a responsible person and make sense of himself. Like, I know I've gotten so many emails from people saying, this is happening to me, or having that experience, what should I do? Like, there are people who
Yeah.
are genuinely interested in understanding themselves better, figuring out what options they have. Am I just kind of relegated to a path of transition if this is what's happening for me? Do I need to eradicate these feelings and drives altogether to live a normal life? Is there somewhere in the middle, right? So I'm very mindful of all the people who are really just trying to do the best with the odd cards they've been dealt. We've all been
Yeah.
dealt some weird cards. And I just think, towards the end of my my initial thread with Aaron, I said, I think we all just need to adopt a little humility because, as you said, this ROGD stuff is unfolding rapidly. We don't really
Yeah.
know. I mean, it's entirely possible that there are no new categories, but it's entirely possible that there's stuff nobody's even thought of yet that is going on. So just some humility and kind of space for all of these different people feels really important.
I think that's a very good note to end on, to remind everybody that we're in the middle of something that has unfolded and that polarizing and suppressing information is probably not helpful. It's really important that we kind of lift it up. Do you want to say a few words about my idea about the public awareness campaign before we finish and
yeah.
we could go into the extra content after?
Yeah, it kind of ties in with what I was just saying. When I think about public awareness, it feels as though we put together public awareness campaigns about behaviors or topics that are mostly agreed upon as being really bad, right? So for example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, public awareness campaign that was very successful. Everybody, for the most part, would agree it's a bad idea to drive drunk and there are serious kind of consequences for yourself and others. I'm not so sure that autogynephilia would need like a public awareness campaign per se. I mean, I think you're right that when we encounter it, it's helpful to know what you're looking at. But the flip side of that is if you have it, how does a public awareness campaign land on you? I guess it depends how it's talked about, how it's discussed. The last thing that we want to do, especially with, in my view, like vulnerable young people who are so primed for ideological brainwashing, is to tell them that they're bad and gross, because that will push them directly into the arms of the activist zealots and all of the stupid tropes about being born in the wrong body and all of that stuff. Like, these vulnerable people are particularly susceptible to cult-like narratives. So I just think anything that we're doing to try and bring things into the light would have to be done with a sufficient amount of compassion for all people involved, including, wow, this is really hard on the parents. Wow, your sister whose underwear you've stolen, this is really hard on her. And you who has these weird compulsions, this is hard on you too, right? So all parties involved deserve some compassion, I think.
Yeah, I'll always err on the side of compassion if I can around anything to do with life, really, because I think life is very difficult. I do strongly believe that there's a need for a public awareness campaign around autogynephilia. I think for a multitude of reasons. One of them would be so that women especially, but also men, can recognize it when they're confronted with it. And so that if they're in a female changing room, if they're in a situation where somebody seems to be sexually charged and they're presenting as female, that they realize they are sexually charged and you are actually taking part in a sex act without your permission. So I think that's a really important aspect of safeguarding just for life, that people need to know that it's happening. For example, furtourism is another paraphilia where men rub up against people on trains and public stage. If you don't know, I didn't know what it was when I was a kid. And I remember I was going across a Cowan Bridge in Dublin. I was only about 13 and I felt really cool. I was really I thought I looked really good. And this guy was doing that to me and I didn't know what it was. And I thought it was because we were so busy. It was such a busy bridge and there was there was so many people on the bridge. I didn't realize it was a thing, if you follow me. I think we have to equip people so they know what they're confronted with. That's number one. But the second reason that I think is very important is, as I said earlier, I'm going to have myself down as a sex freak if I'm not careful. But we all have aspects of our sexual in mind, our private sexual place. There's some crazy stuff that goes on there. Okay?
Yes.
Wait. And if a male with testosterone or a female, whatever, if they know that actually that particular fantasy is kind of not really acceptable societally, they will keep it in its place. So, for example, they might have kind of voyeurism in their private life. a kind of a tendency to fantasize about a voyeuristic kind of scenario. Or or exhibitionist. A lot of people fantasize. Have you ever read the Women's Room, or not the Women's Room, that Nancy Friday book? Christ almighty, it was women's fantasies. It was crazy shit going down in that book. Not in my lovely mind, in other women's minds. But anyway, I want to get to the end of this point. So we can go kind of crazy places in our minds sexually, but we know what's acceptable sexually on a societal level. And we need to know this. We need to know, watch out, that bit is fine. That bit is a little bit dangerous because it can bring in other people who are not consenting to this. So you need to put a lid on it, basically. You might go there fantasy-wise, but don't go there in life. And I think we need to equip people so that they know to put a lid on that particular one, because it can be an imposition on other people. And so that's what we have to do with our fantasies on all sorts of levels, our sexual fantasies. Some of them are particularly easily enacted in life. You know what I mean? Some of them are very easily you can really kind of satisfy some of your sexual fantasies. Some of them you can't. Some of them just should not be enacted. And so I think information will sort ourselves out on that particular point.
I don't know.
Go on.
Well, you're talking about, let's say, a rogue fantasy that comes up in the context of, let's say, a sexual engagement. But autogynephilia is not just a sexual fantasy relegated to the bedroom. It is a 24/7 fantasy about one's identity.
For some people. But for some people, they have traits of.
For some people.
I'm talking about the people with the traits of. You know what I mean? I'm not talking about the people who have this fully fledged Anne Lawrence, you know what I mean, 10 out of 10. I'm talking about all the others who have traits and they kind of unleashed them as a result of an online world.
But there's not even enough self-awareness to know that they're doing that. I mean, the metaphor of transgender has totally overtaken the individual's ability to self-recognize. And even if they do self-recognize, I think it is worthy of debate of whether or not enacting that desire in the world is necessarily the same thing. It's really tricky because we all, like you said, we walk around with various thoughts and ideas and fantasies, and it's hard to say, well, if you behave this way and the reason for it was a sexual fantasy, then you can't do that behavior. It's kind of like, it's precisely what happened with the Gen Spect conference. And I very much defend Gen Spect's, there was no policy, but you certainly are not policing people's clothing, because you can't say, okay, but why are you wearing that particular shade of green? Do you like it too much? How do we go into that space? You know what I mean? It's
secret sex thoughts.
Yeah, it becomes very tricky. Now, all of this is just, I think, an example of how complex these topics are for society at large, for how do we conduct ourselves? How do we tell people to conduct themselves? How much control or not do we try to impose on others' behaviors and thoughts and ideas and how they enact those? So it's all very complicated, but I'm very glad we started to flush this out together. There's a lot to say here.
And we are interested in all civilized, thoughtful comments, and everybody who has, criticism that is kind of given to us in a constructive manner so that we can maybe further explore it. We intend to, interview a rake of different people who will have different experiences and we continue to explore this issue as much as we can in a thoughtful manner. We're not saying we have all the answers. We do say we have a lot of questions and we have a lot of experiences in this, but anybody who has all the answers and who has it all clearly figured out is a snake oil salesman, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in the follow-up discussion, is there a juicy topic that you want to discuss? I have some more thoughts on pseudo-bisexuality if anyone's interested. What about you?
I'm very interested, Sasha. I would also like to talk a little bit about any parents who believe that their kid might have some AGP traits, I would
Great.
like to kind of touch on that so that we can help them out, because I want to kind of free parents. It's okay. It's okay. Between 10 and 20, testosterone comes in, and there can be an awful lot of traits going down, and we don't have to make it a secret in your lives.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take that into the extended conversation. So bye for now.
Yeah. That's it.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.